Hi there, welcome to the European Institute of Fitness. My name is Darren Tonham and this is your pre-learning material to help you best prepare for the amazing experience you're about to embark upon at Lilleshall National Sports Centre with the IF Lilleshall. Now, many students can feel a bit apprehensive, maybe a bit nervous, not knowing exactly what to expect when you arrive. And just to put your mind at ease, when you do, we will be there to support, to inform you about exactly how everything goes. You'll get the timetable, you'll be made really comfortable. And just relax now a little bit, that all of the material that you need to understand and apply will be taught thoroughly through the course with us at Lilleshall National Sports Centre. This is to give you the opportunity to come a little bit more informed about particularly the skeleton and the muscles that make up our body to eat that first week for you. Now, personal training is absolutely amazing. It's far more than just knowing your bones and muscles. We will look at behavioral change, we'll have a look at some coaching techniques, we'll have a look at a whole range of topics and subjects, but underpinning some of the key tools that we need to embrace quickly during your time here to better enhance our own personal form and technique, to be able to better program right, is to understand how the body moves. And this part of your learning is to give you that chance to pre-learn some of those bones and muscles now. Now, if you find the content of this recording fairly easy, then that's great. You're in a really good position to cruise through that first week and to enjoy learning about the body and how it moves and how it responds to exercise. If you feel that after this recording you feel okay, reasonable, that with the face-to-face taught section during the course that you would quickly be able to thoroughly understand these areas, then that is a great outcome too. If you feel that you are absolutely lost and can't retain any information in this recording, then again, it's not the end of the world, but please just flag that to us early in your course that we can provide that support, that of course we will, to make sure you can comfortably get through this part of the course. So hopefully everything's clear, that this is to simply ease the process so that you can thoroughly enjoy your training with us and have a heads up now as to some muscles and movements and the skeleton system online. You'll notice under where I'm speaking from there are some downloads, and I'll just draw your attention to them now. What you're able to actually do is to single click on that top one, activity pre-learning PDF. That's a PDF for you to single click, so you'll just click your mouse, your left button once, and once you do, it will highlight so that you can click save to my computer. And when you've done that, as long as you don't lose this screen to be able to continue to listen to me, you'll be able to print off some sheets to guide you and to give you some activities to do that supports the visuals that you're going to get on screen, and of course the audio with what I'm saying. No need to do that straight away, so by all means you can actually do that at the end, and then you'll have some activities to do to help you. If for any reason you don't have an Adobe or some kind of PDF viewer, then a Word document there, 1997 version of Microsoft Word, the same thing, which is the bottom one there. You don't need both, they're both the same thing, just to make sure that you can download that safely. So what we're going to do is start with perhaps looking at movement, and you can appreciate that we function in a 3D world. It's very common at the moment to have movies in 3D, so we know that we have the technology now to be able to bring that to our TV screens, but the reality is that is the world in which we live. It's not two-dimensional but three-dimensional, and understanding that is going to give us the first start point to be able to look at movement and eventually look at exercises and indeed sports, and to be able to break them down and understand that movement is a series of joint actions in a particular order and a particular firing sequence. And when we start to consider it like that, it will become apparent that understanding those planes of movement in which we operate and the different movements that occur at our joints is a really good way to learn the human skeleton, so that we can better apply it when we look at the different personal training roles that we have in terms of program writing, postural retraining, etc. So we need a start point, we need a reference point to be able to look at those movements, and we call this an anatomical position. And this is a position where we simply stand nice and tall, hands by the side, palms facing forward in a nice neutral position. So whenever we talk about movements, we're talking about the actual movement. It's not a position. Some of the phrases that we use, such as flexion and extension, which you're going to learn about shortly, they're movements, not positions, and therefore we have to have a reference point from which we start. And there are three planes of movement, as we said. There are three dimensions in which the world exists, and we call these our frontal plane, our sagittal plane, and our horizontal plane. And that's what we're going to have a look at. So if we think about the top one first of all, our sagittal plane. Our sagittal plane splits the body into a left-hand side, right-hand side. And the best way, or a way of considering this plane, is a sheet of glass that might split us in half. And you can probably imagine now any movements that's parallel with that, so in that plane, are in the sagittal plane. And if you think about marching or walking, there are two classic movements that occur in that sagittal plane. Forwards and backwards movements are said to be in the sagittal plane. And that's really important to get, not only because we will be asking you at some point in quizzes and tests to be able to list movements in those planes, but it helps us to be able to understand when we look at a leg press, a squat, and a lunge, and understand that movements in all those three exercises are actually the same. They are all in the sagittal plane. Then it helps us to be able to simplify exercise, which will make learning a lot easier when we can do exactly that. So that's our first plane, our sagittal plane. Think about horizontal or transverse plane. This is a plane that cuts our body into upper half, lower half. And for now, the easiest thing to think about is rotation in that plane. And therefore, think about baseball or any kind of golf type action. Then this is a rotational movement, in essence, in our horizontal, sometimes referred to as our transverse plane. And our frontal plane is a plane that splits us into front half, back half. So imagine a plane that goes through us, enabling us to have any movements in this plane, and therefore star jumps, and I'm pretty sure you can imagine yourself doing star jumps. That will be a movement said to be in the frontal plane. So there's our three planes. Think about moving forwards and backwards, sagittal. Think about rotational type movements. There's a particular shoulder exercise or movement that we'll look at shortly is in our horizontal plane, and our frontal plane is those movements where we don't move forwards or backwards, but we're moving out to the sides and back, and this is our frontal plane. Sometimes it helps to think about some common exercises, and I've put just 5 on the board for you: lat pull down, seated row, chest press, leg press, and shoulder press. And later in this recording, there's some video of the exercises in case any of the exercises are not familiar ones to you, so you'll get a chance to perhaps play this recording if you were unsure about some exercises. But there's 5 common gym exercises, and perhaps I'll have a look at what planes they occur in. And we'll take the first one, lat pull down. I don't know whether you're familiar with that pull down. This is a wide lat pull down that I'm thinking about, and you can probably associate that and think about that being the frontal plane. That it's nothing going forwards and backwards. It is literally our hands are up and we're pulling down in that frontal plane. And when we go and look at some videos in a minute, you'll see exactly what I mean. I've got a seated row. So if you think about a seated row, and then here what we do is we're pulling back towards us, then this is indeed in the same plane in which we march. This is our forwards and backwards plane, and that was called our sagittal plane. So if we think about a seated row, that's going to be in our sagittal plane. So this pre-learning is first trying to help us to understand, when we look at simple gym exercises, to try and work out what plane they're in. Now we talk about chest press. There was this particular movement I said at the shoulder that we should be aware of, and it's in the same plane as when we rotate. And when we have our elbows up, so think about that anatomical position that we talked about at the beginning, where we had our elbows into our sides, palms facing forward. If, however, we start with our elbows high in a chest press movement, then this is said to be in the horizontal plane. and therefore chest press and bench press and those wide grip press ups that we might do, or push ups, they're all in that horizontal plane. You can see that it occurs in that plane. The square around the waist here in the horizontal plane, if you was to raise that up to the shoulder level, you can see that it's occurring in that plane. And this is often the plane that people have the most trouble with, and we'll spend some time with the videos really reinforcing this. So roll with it for now, and when we get through all of this presentation and then you've downloaded the downloads that I mentioned before, you may wish to review this again, because you'll have had the whole thing once to see the videos as well, and the second time round, the second time through, this will hopefully make a lot of sense. Think about leg press. Now imagine leg press is pushing forwards and backwards. There isn't any movement out to the sides. There is not rotational, and the horizontal shoulder movement is only for the shoulder. Therefore, look at leg press. Leg press is another sagittal plane exercise. It's solely pushing forwards and backwards, albeit it occurs from the hips, knees and ankles. Lastly, we think about shoulder press, for example. Now, I don't know whether you can picture that. Move backwards slowly. So if we've got shoulder press, then we're going up and down. We can probably appreciate this is in that plane that cuts us into front half, back half, as on your screen, the frontal plane, and indeed shoulder press is a exercise that's in the frontal plane. Hopefully that's okay. I'm going to run through some more slides to clarify and reinforce this, and then we'll take a look at some videos so we can see these movements, and I'll continue to talk through them so that we can really lay down this foundation that we understand what planes of movements exist and what particular movements at different joints occur in those planes. So the sagittal plane. Hopefully you'll notice on your screen that there's an awful lot of extensions and flexion words, and that is what make this plane quite easy to understand. That from that anatomical position, whether we've got elbow flexion extension, knee flexion and extension, hip flexion extension, or shoulder flexion extension, any of those flexion extensions I've just said, they're occurring in the sagittal plane. And therefore, there's our first probably point to look at when we're working at exercises and what muscles are involved in different exercises that we see in a gym. If it's in the sagittal plane, it's that forwards, backwards, in front of us, behind us type movement, then we're looking at flexion extension, whether it's at the hip, knee, elbow, or even the trunk in terms of bowing, flexion and extension, neck, indeed wrist. So any of those flexion extension movements are movements in the sagittal plane. Hopefully that is fairly easy to sort of see, certainly on the screen when you see so many flexions extensions, and the video in a minute will help. In the frontal plane, we've got abduction and adduction. Abduction, as AB, is away from, so abduct is to take away. So shoulder abduction is that movement away from the midline of the body, and you might see that as something like a lateral raise. Whereas shoulder adduction is a movement from where it ended up in the abduction exercise back to neutral and pushing down. If you've got hip abduction, adduction, again, hip abduction is going to be in the frontal plane. It's going to be a side kick out to the side. Abduction is away from, and adduction is going to be back to neutral. We'll also have, and the terminology has changed a little bit, but lateral flexion, or bending to the right, bending to the left and back. This is occurring again in the frontal plane. It's not going forwards or backwards, so it's occurring in that plane, that sheet of glass that cuts us into forward half and the backwards half. That's what that one is. And we've got lateral flexion of the neck, for example. So just moving our neck one side or the other. Again, you can see this is not coming forwards or backwards. This will be in the sagittal plane, flexion extension, but it's not. It's actually in this frontal plane, so it's lateral flexion extension. Now, some terms to obviously learn here, and I'm sure at least on the second time around you'll be making some notes and filling in the forms that I said were for download. Just have a look at this and I'll show you some video. Our last plane here, horizontal plane, this is where we've got some key movements that we should really emphasize. One was that horizontal shoulder flexion extension in your chest press or press up type movement. We've also got rotation is in the horizontal plane, and we also have, particularly of all the rotations that we have, external, internal rotation at the shoulder enables us to really understand that rotational type movement. So when we look at the shoulder, we've already discussed flexion and extension at the shoulder will be in the sagittal plane. Abduction and adduction at the shoulder would be in the frontal plane. We've got horizontal flexion and extension is going to be in the horizontal plane, as is internal and external rotation. And hopefully this is not losing you and you're just about catching up, so that when I show you the videos, this will hopefully start to sink in. Let's just have a look at some videos now. Now I'm going to carry on talking, but just play some videos now and just talk through some exercises. The one on the left is shoulder flexion on the way up and extension on the way down. Let's have a look at what that looks like. So hopefully you can see it's in that marching plane. And that's why that marching plane is what we said was our sagittal plane. And on the way down it's extension. On the way up it's shoulder flexion. So we've got flexion and extension at the shoulder occurring in that plane. Have a look at now abduction and adduction. So we've now moved to the frontal plane, and you'll see abduction will occur on the way up and away from the body, and adduction on the way back. So that's our two dominant planes, and you can see those two exercises. So I'll just do that again. So again, on the left hand side here, we've got hopefully clearly movements that's in the sagittal plane, flexion on the way up, extension on the way down. And on the right hand side, it's now in the frontal plane, and we've got abduction on the way up and adduction on the way back down. So hopefully we've got those two planes now really fixed in our mind, and at the shoulder joint at least we can see that we've got flexion extensions out in front of us and abduction adduction is out to the side of us. And there's the two types of movements that we can embrace. I'll stay on the videos for a moment, so we'll just keep the videos. We'll finish off the shoulder. So there's that last plane, horizontal plane, that we want to work on, and you probably see now Sharon here is going to go through that horizontal plane. Now if you remember on the first picture, it was like a square box around the person's waist. So just raise it up to the shoulders, you can see it's occurring in that plane. It's not occurring in that plane that's a sagittal plane, it would be breaking that. Nor is it occurring in that frontal plane, it would be breaking that sheet of glass. It's now a plane of glass. If you imagine there's a sheet of glass above her arms, parallel with the floor, and below her arms, parallel with the floor, it's staying within that plane. Coming forward there, that movement was horizontal shoulder flexion, and then when she returns to where she started, that's horizontal shoulder extension. Horizontal shoulder flexion, horizontal shoulder extension. Now just to remind you of what you're trying to get out of this, we will be going through all of these, but by having this little bit of preparatory time now, this work put in, it will help you to get this more quickly so that you can really enjoy the practical reinforcement we have of this in the gym quickly and over the first week we'll feel really comfortable with all of these movements and the muscles which bring those movements about. Still staying within the horizontal plane, remember the other key movement that we have in this plane is rotation, and we have an example of here I'm going to play now for you. And whether we are going to read the American or English or Australian textbook, we have a little bit of terminology. Sometimes internal rotation, which you can see here, is going back in towards the middle. Internal and medial rotation are both the same thing, just two different words, unfortunately, for the same thing. But as both could come up in different texts that you read, it's worth us making sure we know both of them. Whereas on the way back out, you'll see now this is lateral or external rotation. Internal rotation on the way in, and external rotation as she opens the chest back out. Internal rotation as she goes back in towards the tummy, and external rotation as she moves back out. So we now kind of have those key movements about the shoulder. We had flexion, extension, abduction and adduction, and that was in the, first of all, the sagittal plane. So we had shoulder flexion, extension in that plane. Then we had it in the frontal plane, shoulder abduction and shoulder adduction, frontal plane. And in the horizontal plane, we've had horizontal shoulder flexion and horizontal shoulder extension. Finally, we've got this rotation. We've got internal or medial rotation, and we have external or lateral rotation, and they are some key movements that actually make up a massive amount of our upper body exercises. Let's stay on the theme of using videos, but we'll perhaps have a look at some legs, and then we'll go back to the slides to reinforce this. So just one the other way around. So what we'll have a look at is some hips first of all, and hopefully you can see on the top left one, she's about to go out to the side. Remember, anything out to the side is going to be abduction, adduction. So on the way up, it's hip abduction. On the way down, hip adduction. And this is movement occurring in the, hopefully you can fill in the gap in your head at least, that was in the frontal plane. Whereas on the one on the right hand, the one below, we'll have a look at these exercises, and hopefully you can see it's more like marching. So this is the sagittal plane, and we've got hip flexion going up and hip extension coming back down. Hip flexion going up and hip extension coming back down. This is in the sagittal plane, so this is hip flexion and extension. So we've got therefore two movements that pair up there, hip flexion extension, and the previous one, hip abduction adduction. We can have a little look at some knee movements, which will be, I think, fairly self-explanatory. That we've got knee flexion as the heel went up, and knee extension as it goes back to the floor. Knee flexion and knee extension. Hopefully you can see that is in that marching plane. That's in the sagittal plane again. So hopefully this has been reinforced by me keep repeating and repeating, and yeah, hopefully you're starting to see this. Whereas on the way one below, have a look at the elbow. Again, it should be straight forward, elbow flexion and elbow extension, elbow flexion on the way up, elbow extension on the way back down, elbow flexion and extension. So hopefully this is proving useful. I'll have a look at ankle, and this is going to be the big screen display for you, and there are some specific names to the ankle, and this is going to be occurring in the sagittal plane, and what we have is a movement called plantar flexion toe down and dorsiflexion toe up. I'll be reinforcing this on slides in a moment. Plantar flexion pointing down, dorsiflexion on the way up. This is also on the sheets that you have to download, so it's the same information. I've just got it on slides, in video, and on the sheets that you're going to download. We'll come back and have a look at the scapular ones in a moment. Let's just go and reinforce all of this back in our main virtual classroom. So we're back where we were just now. Just move through and have a look at first of all, 3D movement, shoulder circumduction, where we have a circling movement. Let's just beg your pardon. What we have is a movement 3 planes, and at the shoulder joint, move backwards slowly. We are able to do this with this circling type movement, and you've probably done those in kind of warm-ups, I'm sure, playing different sorts of sports. That circling movement, that really cuts across all 3 planes, and that's a movement that we reserve the phrase for the shoulder and for the hip joint, and they're the 2 ball and socket joints, which become clear as we start through the course with you when you start with it initial, so that is absolutely clear for you why certain joints have that ability to circle like that. You saw the video just now, so you had the idea, I think, that we had plantar flexion as the toe pointed down, and we had dorsiflexion as the toe pointed up. And they're the main movements at the ankle joint. We often associate the following 2 movements at the ankle joint as well, and that's inversion rolling in and eversion with the ankle rolling out as well. We should probably focus for the moment on that plantar flexion and that dorsiflexion movements at the ankle. There is a specific movement that occurs midway between the wrist and the elbow, and we have 2 bones there we're going to go through in a moment, our radius and our ulnar, and they actually touch each other. And when any 2 bones meet, they form a joint or an articulation, and therefore there is this particular joint where the radius and ulnar touch, and that enables us to have this palm up movement. And if you just do that movement now at home, trying to stabilize your shoulder joint, so don't move your shoulder, don't move your elbow, you can actually find that you can have palm up, palm down without moving the elbow at all, and certainly not the shoulder. And this is our radio-ulnar joint, and this is relevant for different grips, and this will all fit together when we have a look at how we can change the grip on an exercise, and we can get effects as a consequence. So this relates to often the grip that we have in different exercises. The last bit here, and then I'll flip back to the video to reinforce this bit, is we have a scapula at the back of our shoulder, and they actually move, and therefore this relates much more to posture rather than main movements that we see in traditional gym exercises. But they certainly relate to how we can maintain really good posture through those regular gym exercises. And our scapula have 4 key movements that we should be familiar with. Protraction, which is where we come forward. Retraction, where we hold them and pin them back. Elevation, where we have our shoulders coming up towards our ears, but the scapula actually raise. And depression, when they actually come down. So I think the video will probably help this most easily. So let's take a little trip back and just see the video. And I'm just going to play now the first one on the right hand side at the top, where we see those shoulders rounding at the front. That's scapular protraction, but when we see them really coming back, that's scapular retraction. So that scapular protraction is then rounding at the front, and scapular retraction is that much better posture position that we probably associate good posture with at the back. So protraction coming forward and retraction coming back. Hopefully that makes some sense. Whereas when we look at elevation going up and scapular depression coming down, again that elevation is that posture sort of position we don't want to see, whereas that nice shoulders coming down, it's actually the scapula pulling them down is what we do want to see. So generally when the shoulders down, like I've paused it now, that's therefore scapular depression, and we want the scapula retracted like above, there are two positions that we want to generally reinforce through our exercises and movements. A scapular retracted position. A scapular retraction is a movement that we want to see in exercise, and avoid too much shoulder scapular protraction, and we want to see scapular depression but avoid seeing or encouraging too much scapular elevation. Okay, we're going well. Hopefully you're still with me, not too lost. So we've gone through a whole range of movements there, and the next section or segment we're going to have a look at is going to be bones. And if you felt that you wanted to pause, you can. You'll see at the bottom of your screen ability to pause at any point. So by all means now you might want to pause, print off those notes, take a breather, or come back when you're ready and have a look at some bones, and then we're going to do some muscles. So there's our main movements. We had at the shoulder, we had shoulder flexion and extension, we had shoulder abduction, adduction, and we had shoulder horizontal flexion and horizontal extension. We also had shoulder rotation and circumduction, and there were all the movements of the shoulder. At the hip, we had hip flexion and hip extension. We also had hip abduction and hip adduction. We also have hip rotation, and we have circumduction, and there's all the movements at the hip joint. At the elbow, which is much more simple, we just have elbow flexion and extension. At the knee joint, we just have knee flexion and extension. And those joints, of course, cover the vast majority of the movements in exercise as a personal trainer that we are going to come across. We also have, however, the ankle joint. So we had plantar flexion to actually point the toe down, and dorsiflexion to point the toe up. And we had scapula, which was really based around posture, and we had elevation as the scapula was up, depression, pulling it down, protraction, pulling it forward, and retraction, pulling it back. And they were the main joints that we're interested in, and the main movements that we need to be familiar with. The second section, which is one of those, it's probably doing the activity in the download, which is below where I'm speaking from, and just really have a go at labeling the skeleton once I've gone through it for you. And although the answers behind the page, so the next page of the handout, page 2, you'll see the answers. Try to avoid using those, have a go yourself, and maybe print it out 2 or 3 times until you've got it 78% right. Then you're in a great position as you arrive, and you get taught everything again, but you'll be able to have a big smile on your face because you already either know it or you're already halfway there, which will just ease those first few days when you're here. So here are some bones. A skull or cranium is certainly one category of bones. Clavicle or collarbone is another bone. Our sternum is our breastbone, so our sternum. We've got ribs, which you may be familiar with as well, and of course all of these are in your manual when you arrive, and you'll get that on your first day as you arrive, which is a full manual for you to be able to really use as a resource through all of the training that we obviously do. Our humerus is our main bone that makes up the upper arm. We also have our ulna, which is finger side, and our radius, which rotates, which is thumb side. Now we have some bones that make up the wrist and hands. Our carpals make up our wrist bones, our metacarpals make up our hand bones, and our phalanges make up our fingers. So we're getting halfway there, looking good. Our spine, we're probably already familiar with. That's that bone, of course, that or series of bones that make up a vertebral column and sort of link the whole brain to the rest of our body. We have our pelvis, which you're probably familiar with. Our femur is our main long leg bone. A patella, otherwise known as our kneecap. And then we have our fibula and tibia, Our tibia is our main shin bone, and our fibula is the one next to it. So our tibia is our big main shin bone, and our fibula is the one that's next to it. We then have, in the same way that we had carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, we have tarsals for our ankle bones, we have metatarsals for our feet bones, and we have phalanges for our toes. So we're getting lots of bone names here, and hopefully you'll be able to go through these several times and start to label your own diagram, which is in the handout, to give an activity to have a go. Our scapula, so this is our shoulder blades. Our main heel bone, which is just relevant to know for now. It will help later with some attachments that we'll talk about. And particularly we look at the pelvis region and the back region, or the spine. We have, first of all, for the spine, we should really know that there's three main parts that make up our spine. Our cervical spine, which is the next part of our spine, the thoracic spine, which is the middle part of our spine, and our lumbar spine, which is the lower part of our spine. Think of lumbar, lower part of our spine. Cervical towards the top, and thoracic is in the middle. Equally, at the bottom here, we have our sacrum and coccyx, and we have our ilium and ischium that make the top main big flat area of our pelvis, the ilium, and then the bottom part there, and the ischium. You might think about ichibum or ischium, is that the bottom part of that pelvis bone. And there you have it. There are all the main bones of the body. Before we move on, this is just a question now of if you've just come back, or if you've continued all the way through since we started. Take some time now and probably download that activity and have a go at just trying to remember as many of those bones as possible. It's going to help us, because what we'll be doing in class when you're here with us is we'll be having a look at muscles, where they go from and to. And if we tell you it goes from one particular bone or area of a bone to another, that's going to massively help you, if you know where those bones are, to be able to work out then probably what that muscle does. So there's our bones, and hopefully not as difficult as you might think. And at the moment you're learning what? You're learning from home, from just some video pod with someone talking about these bones, and hopefully having a go at filling in the activity sheets that I've done. If you can just get part way there through this medium, then once we get to be able to physically stand up and move our bodies through these movements, physically go to our gym and actually go through the chest press, the seated row, that pull down, like it is on screen, but physically go and do it, you can imagine it's going to quickly come, and you're going to feel really comfortable that you do know those main movements and the muscles that are associated. But for now, there's our bones, and hopefully there is something that you can quickly learn by doing the activities that's on the download below the camera pod from where I'm talking to you from. Because now I want to have a look at muscles. Again, if you want to take a break, then now will be a time to pause and to come back once you've had a rest, or come back another day and tackle muscles. Trying to tackle all of this in one, if you're struggling, would be a mistake. You're best off trying to do this in chunks. And chunk 1 was movements, and there's planes of movements. Chunk 2 is your bones, and this third chunk is muscles. They are the 3 chunks that make up this learning, and probably if you're not already now got your bones or are confused with your muscles, I wouldn't continue. I would try to focus on one of those chunks and then move to the next, and then when you're ready, we'll move to muscles. If you're feeling good, either because you've done some of this sort of thing before, or indeed you've come back now because you have spent time on those last 2 chunks, let's have a look at some muscles. So, here are some main muscles of the body, and I'm going to just go through some of these, and once I just grab my pointer, just point where some of them are. Anterodeltoid. Now, What we have on the body is an area called deltoids, and this is really our shoulder muscles. But there is a front, and the word for front is anterior, and that particularly is important to separate from the medial, which is on the outside, versus the posterior, which is at the back. So our deltoids are made up into three parts, but our anterior deltoid is the front part of our shoulder muscle. Our medial deltoid is the more outer part of our deltoid or shoulder muscle. Our pec major, our pectoralis major, is the main chest muscle that we have. Interestingly, it does attach down the sternum, also attaches across the clavicle, as well as, of course, onto the humerus. And that makes it quite special because it is able to pull in more than one direction. And we will go through that physically with you when we get a chance to do this face to face. But it's interesting, just there is a major muscle that make up the front of our body, the pec major, and it's involved in an awful lot of push type movements. Whenever we're pushing something away from us, we're going to be having pectoralis major involved. Moment really, we're just looking at where these muscles are. You're probably fairly familiar with biceps. They're quite common muscles that people talk about, the biceps and triceps. But the biceps is the front of the arm. So that's our biceps. Probably interested in hip flexors. Now our hip flexors, in a minute I'm going to put this on your screen, are iliopsoas and our rectus femoris. But there are two main hip flexors that we should be interested in. And these are muscles that attach onto the hip or the pelvis and onto the femur. And the key thing is here that they flex the hip. They bring the knee up, hence called hip flexors. And they're often tight. And therefore they're going to be muscles that we're probably going to get quite familiar with in terms of trying to stretch them. Gluteus medius, so this is a muscle on our outside. So we have gluteus medius on both sides, pointing to the most obvious one. Our gluteus medius, our glutes are our big kind of bum muscle, and our medius is on the outside, whereas our glute maximus is on the back, which is the other main glute muscle that we talk about, which I'll show you when we have a look at the rear of the model on your screen. Tibialis anterior, less talked about, but this is a muscle to the front of our shin. Probably best shown on this person's right leg. Tibialis anterior runs at the front of our shin, and of course we've got our abdominals. Our abdominals make up our midsection, and in the hand that I've got, it separates them into our rectus abdominis, otherwise known as our six-pack, our transverse abdominis, which somewhat wraps around our midsection, and our obliques, which run diagonally to the sides of our midsection, abdominal area. So there's our abdominals. For the moment, it's simply important that you're prepared for when we start to work these muscles and understand in more detail what they do, that you're familiar. When we say pec major, you quickly collect your chest and say, yeah, that's my pec major. When we say your deltoids, you know we're talking about shoulder muscles, and you're ready to ask the question, do you mean front, back, or middle? But the technical names, anterior for front, posterior for back, medial for middle. You know where the biceps are. You know that these are the hip flexors, and our quads, which I actually missed, didn't I? And our quadriceps make up the main thigh muscle. You see this large quadricep here, made up of four, as you probably expect with the word quad or quad bike. Quadriceps, there's four heads, so we've got four muscles that make up the quadriceps. And again, in the handout or in the download that you have, it talks through those four quadricep muscles: your vastus lateralis on the outside, your vastus medialis on the inside, your vastus intermedius in the middle, and your rectus femoris over the top. And there are four main quadriceps. A very special one of those four, the rectus femoris, you'll probably remember 2 minutes ago I also said was a hip flexor. So a particularly important quadricep muscle is our rectus femoris, because not only is it a quadricep muscle, it's also a hip flexor and is often tight. And after all, we're going to do a lot of stretching, probably with that and the iliopsoas, which I said was the main hip flexor. So hopefully that's okay. So we can probably turn him around. So on the back, you can probably see that we therefore have a posterior deltoid. Our main back muscle is our latissimus dorsi. So this is the main back muscle here that I'm pointing to, our latissimus dorsi. We also have a trapezius, and the muscle here on his right side as we're looking at it from the back, this is our trapezius. And interesting, what we have here as well are fibers that go in different directions. So we often refer to upper traps, we often refer to more middle traps, and we also refer to lower traps. And each area within those trapezius muscles, we see just different movements or different emphasis being played. So we've got our upper traps, which is up towards the neck there. We've got our mid traps, which go across left to right, and we have our lower traps that make up our trapezius. Underneath that, you'll see that we have our rhomboids, and this is just how the trapezius peeled away now on his left side. Our rhomboids closest to the spine, and they particularly retract the scapula. If you remember, we talked about when the scapula retracts, we're talking about something to do with posture. So when we talk about rhomboids, incidentally also mid-trapezius, we're talking more postural control than any kind of large movement generation. Gluteus maximus we mentioned, but now we can see it. So our big rump, this is our gluteus maximus. We've got our calves. Our calves are made up of two main muscles, our gastrocnemius and our soleus. So our gastrocnemius and our soleus. Interestingly, the gastrocnemius is particularly important because it crosses both the knee and ankle joint. So our gastrocnemius is particularly important as it crosses two joints, not just one. But the main thing is that we're familiar with where they are, what they're called. Our rectus spinae is our lower back muscle. It goes literally all the way up, and you can probably see that just tracing all the way up. But our rectus spinae, most of its fibers and content we often refer to as being lower down. So that's our rectus spinae, our lower back. And our triceps, which we mentioned before, which you can probably just try to point in here, the back of our arm. As I said, what we're most interested in at this point is being familiar just with where they are to help us to accelerate our learning when we are in class together soon. By learning our bones, which you're now partway through, and by understanding that muscles attach from one bone to another bone, we can probably put the concept together that therefore when they contract or shorten, they create movement. And as personal trainers, we're obviously interested in movement. And we will be in class residentially when we're all together, looking at exactly how that happens. So I've just given an example with some simple red lines there for something like the pec major, where those fibers attached to the sternum and onto the humerus. We could probably see that that could bring about horizontal flexion. And what we'll be doing is looking at our skeletons and going to the gym to reinforce this, but physically. I'm just trying to give you an idea for now, just to pick one muscle, the pec major. So there's also some fibers attached to the clavicle and the humerus. You could probably now see that it also brings about shoulder flexion. And hopefully this is now starting to force you to put together the movements that we did in the first 15 minutes and now the muscles that we've done in the last 15 minutes. To understand now how we can get quite clever here and understand how different movements are created by certain muscles contracting and shortening. And similarly, the pec major happens to also assist in shoulder adduction, and you can see if there's some fibers that are attached lower down on the sternum and onto the humerus, as it pulls it down, it must also assist in that too. So I'm not going to go through all of them like this. This is certainly for our training residentially that is very exciting and very close, where you're going to thoroughly enjoy, at times being thrown in the deep end, and at times having to study hard, but having the full support of our whole training team to make sure that everyone gets this and understands this and enjoys applying this practically. Lastly, just while we were talking about the pec major, it also internally rotates. So by simply understanding that it attached where it attached, it brought about horizontal shoulder flexion. It brought about shoulder flexion. It contributed to shoulder adduction, and also brought about shoulder rotation. And they are indeed the key movements that we should be interested in when we talk about the pec major. To summarize, and then we're going to go to some more video to reinforce, these were indeed the main movements that we saw in the first 15 minutes or so of this recording. There was 9 main movements that I talked about. I want to talk about particularly the first 6, but shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, and they occurred in the sagittal plane. Horizontal shoulder flexion and horizontal shoulder extension, they occurred in the horizontal plane. First one in the sagittal plane, second 2 there, second pair in the horizontal plane, and 5 and 6 there occurred in the frontal plane. Shoulder flexion and extension in the sagittal plane, horizontal flexion, horizontal extension in the horizontal plane, and abduction, adduction in the frontal plane. We talked about elbow. We got flexion and extension, and that was really simple, hopefully, because it occurs in the sagittal plane. When we talked about the hip, we got again hip flexion and hip extension in the sagittal plane, hip abduction, adduction in the frontal plane, and then we have the rotations and circumductions. I'm most interested at the moment in those first 4 as we go to the video to reinforce this in some real gym exercises. At the knee, we got flexion and extension. The ankle, we talked about the most important 2 for now that we wanted to focus on, plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, both in the sagittal plane, toe pointing down, plantar flexion, toe up, dorsiflexion. And lastly, we have the scapula, protraction and retraction, elevation and depression. Protraction, that poor postural position that we might associate with the rounding of the shoulders to the front. Retraction, where we hold them back, our scapula come together at the back. Elevation is where they raise up, which we want to avoid. Depression is where they come down, we want to promote. So let's now try to apply that and some muscles by using some video. Here we go. So let's have a look at wide grip lat pull down. Here we go. On the way down, hopefully you can see, first of all, the movement up and down is in the frontal plane. So we're going to be talking about abduction and adduction of the shoulder. And hopefully you can see, if you just try to ignore the elbows, on the way down, it's shoulder adduction. And as she releases back up, it's shoulder abduction. I'm going to stick with this one for a little bit until we can see it, and we'll just play this again.
And stop.
Let's just look at the elbows. As she pulls down, hopefully you can see that's elbow flexion. As she releases up, elbow extension. So the pulling movement, as she pulls down, it was elbow flexion. As she pulls down, it's shoulder adduction, AD. And therefore we can summarize the key movements in that lat pull down, and it's also being familiar with lat pull down, how to do it correctly. But what we're looking at is it's a frontal plane type exercise. It's abduction and adduction, their terminology that we should be talking about, and it's shoulder adduction as she's pulling down, and it's elbow flexion in terms of pulling down, but now to elbow joint. Let's compare that, just so we can see where this goes and applies. Let's compare that to maybe a reverse grip lat pull down. So first of all, maybe you're not familiar with a reverse grip lat pull down. You now will be, and that in itself is going to be useful when you come and see us. But here, hopefully, you can start to see this is now a different plane, but it's changed the movement, and it's now that marching plane. It's actually in the sagittal plane. On the way down, it's shoulder extension. On the way down, shoulder extension. On the way up, shoulder flexion. Think about that first as I showed you. Shoulder extension, shoulder flexion. And therefore also on the way down we have elbow movements we have elbow flexion on the way down and elbow extension on the way up. If you can just look at Mark there, the shoulder movement. On the way down, shoulder extension. On the way up, shoulder flexion. Watch it again. So ignore his elbows, imagine they were straight. Just to visualize and see kind of what's going on there. I immediately compare and contrast this with the video that we had right at the beginning, where I showed you shoulder flexion extension. Can you imagine now that if I pause at the top, if she had now that lat bar in her hand, but both hands up, she could pull it down. If she actually bent her elbow, it's that reverse, that pull down we've just seen. Let's just do that again. If you can imagine now she's holding the bar, but bent her elbow, she came down. That would be the now putting the hard work in to just really understanding movements. And at the end of this, I will really emphasize what's important to walk away with and what is just nice to know if you're coping well with this material when we finish. And
3, 2,
perhaps focusing
1,
first
go.
of all solely on the hips and seeing from there to straight. What we have is the hips go through hip extension, hip flexion as he comes back, but hip extension as he pushes away. Perhaps now have a look this time at the knees.
1, go. 1, go.
The knees as he pushes away is knee extension, knee flexion as he comes down, and knee extension as he pushes. Knee extension. And we probably have one last look at the ankle, and what we might see is he's pushing. We've got plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion occurs, the angle gets less, then you actually see a little bit of plantar flexion. Not as easy to see on that, you'll see it more probably in the squat. But if you have a look at that whole movement, what you'll probably see when I show you now squats, that there really is no difference. That what we've got is essentially a leg press, but now standing up rather than being on his back. That on the way up, we've got hip extension. Again, on the way up, we've got knee extension. And again, on the way up, it's got plantar flexion. And therefore, in a squat, we've got exactly the same movements that we have in a leg press. That's shown there in slow motion. Relative, we look at just his front leg perhaps to begin with. In the lunge above, we're going to see a similar sort of thing. That we've got hip extension on the way up. We've also got knee extension on the way up. We've also got plantar flexion. And the point really is just this, that when we talk about all these, and they're called compound exercises because they use more than one joint, but these common leg exercises, it could be a step up, it could be a leg press, a lunge or a squat, they're essentially the same in terms of movements. They all require the hip to move through hip extension, which is your gluteus maximus. They require the quads to contract to bring about knee extension, and they require the hamstrings and glutes in that hip extension that I just talked through. So they've all got hip extension, knee extension, and ankle plantar flexion. Hip extension being glutes and hamstrings, knee extension being quadriceps, and plantar flexion being calves. And therefore we get all the main muscles that make up our legs involved in these exercises, which is why they're so good. If we just go back for a second, and we'll have a look at the lat pull down again briefly. As he pulls down, it was shoulder extension, and this is our lats, teres major, posterior deltoids. And we also saw elbow flexion and therefore biceps. That it really is just now combining, seeing what movements are occurring in those joints, and then knowing what muscles bring about those movements, and we're able to piece this whole thing together. Perhaps we have a look at a few examples of some exercises. You'll see here now Sharon doing exercise, and what I just need to see, what we have is a horizontal plane movement. She comes back there, horizontal shoulder extension, but horizontal shoulder flexion as she pushes. And that's the main thing, is when she pushes, horizontal shoulder flexion, horizontal shoulder extension as she goes back. Also at the elbow, you'll see as she pushes away, you've got elbow extension. And the elbow extension will mean it's triceps, and the horizontal shoulder flexion will mean it's pec major and anterior deltoid. And you can probably see this is clearly occurring in this horizontal plane. Glass plate cutting her body into upper half, lower half is in that plane of movement. We have a look at a simple dumbbell press on the bottom one here, very briefly. Hopefully you can see it's exactly the same. All she's done is rotated through 90 degrees the whole body, and now pushing in the air, or he is, sorry, straight up and down rather than out. But it's still, hopefully you can see, a horizontal movement. It's not marching, and it's not adduction going away from the body. It's in that horizontal plane. On the way up, it's horizontal shoulder flexion. On the way down, horizontal shoulder extension. Elbow extension on the way up, elbow flexion on the way down. So triceps to bring about the elbow extension, and it's pec major and anterior deltoid bring about the horizontal shoulder flexion. Finally, we can probably have a look at a simple shoulder exercise, so dumbbell shoulder press. And again, it's just looking, this is now in that frontal plane. This is just to reinforce planes more than anything else. Not about too detailed muscles at this point, that doesn't matter. That will come as we do our face-to-face training. But we've got shoulder abduction on the way up, adduction on the way down. Shoulder abduction on the way up, adduction on the way down. And also we've got triceps because the elbow is extending as well. Let's just listen to, let's see that a little bit more. Some way up. We've got medial deltoids to bring about shoulder abduction, and we've got triceps to bring about elbow extension. So hopefully head's probably now full of muscles and movements, and the videos perhaps helped a little bit. Go back to the slides to try and reinforce now further what we've just learned in terms of seeing those videos. That if we try to piece this together now, in terms of the upper body muscles, we've got pec major and anterior deltoid often working together, and they were the two big chest muscles, shoulder muscles that's involved in pushing. We've also got medial deltoid, particularly when we push up as opposed to away from us, and therefore we had pec major, anterior deltoid, particularly in horizontal shoulder flexion and also shoulder flexion, and we've got medial deltoids in terms of shoulder abduction. Then we've got this group together, our latissimus dorsi, our posterior deltoid, and teres major, and this was when we pull. So our lats will help us to be able to, in the seated row, to pull that bar towards us, or in the lat pull down, to be able to pull down in that exercise. Whenever we have the latissimus dorsi, our lats working, teres major really is latissimus dorsi little helper. We're going to have teres major working, and a posterior deltoid often involved in that type of pulling movement. Whereas on the right hand side, these were not main movers. Trapezius was about posture. You had that upper, middle and lower fibers that we talked about, and they relate to scapular movements. Our upper traps bring about elevation, our middle traps bring about retraction, and our lower traps bring about depression. We have our rhomboids, which was underneath our traps, particularly involved in scapular retraction. So again, you can see more postural muscles. Our pec minor brings about protraction, as does serratus anterior. So we have then these controlling movements, these scapular movements, this postural type side on the right, but we have our main movers on the left, our pec major and anterior deltoid often working together, our medial deltoid, and our lats, posterior deltoid and teres major, often working together. Then we have, in terms of our lower body, we had the gluteus maximus, which was that large muscle at the back, our bum if you like, and that was about hip extension. Our gluteus medius is about hip abduction, but also really is a very controlling muscle. It brings about stability about the hip. And our hamstrings, which also contribute to hip extension, but also bring about knee flexion. We've got our hip flexors. So that was, I said, was muscle that's often tight. So they flex the hip, but also the rectus femoris is not only a hip flexor, also appears in our quadriceps list with the other three, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. We've got our hip adductors, our inside thigh, and our calves, if you remember, I mentioned as gastrocnemius and soleus. And that is it. They are the key muscles that we probably need to be aware of. Probably now need to just get some pointers as to what matters most and what's going to help you most to be able to come to Lilleshall and be as familiar with as possible. Doing the pre-learning activity that's in your download, again, just to remind you how to do that, you need to single click, so just left mouse click on activity prelearning.doc or .pdf. The PDF is a useful one to download because it won't change format depending on your computer system. It's a PDF. If you haven't got a PDF viewer, then that's why there's a doc one on there as well for you. But the PDF now, it's the bottom one. It's single click, and then you can click Save to My Computer. Print it off a couple of times and run through, do the activity. If you can get kind of halfway there, if you like, then you're in a good position coming to Lilleshall. If you can get 3/4 way there, you're in an excellent position ready to start the course. And if you can be familiar with everything that's on those sheets, then that's going to make things an awful lot easier. But don't worry if you can't. The course live tuition is about helping you to learn all this stuff. This is just a taster. This is just a start to ease this part of your learning. What's most important to know? Knowing your bones and knowing where your muscles are. Full stop. That is more than enough. If you also are fairly familiar with the movements that occur at all of those joints, and maybe even some of the main muscles that bring about those movements, then you're in a very strong position. Hopefully you've made your way through all of this. I'm sure you'll play this through a couple of times. I'm sure you'll go through those activities on the sheet that are prepared for you, and we're looking forward to meeting you really soon at Lilleshall National Sports Centre. My name is Darren Towlam. Have a great time looking through this material, and we look forward to teaching you very soon.